Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg, and I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is the second event in our 2022 Spring Speaker Series, and we're really thrilled to have our colleague Nelly Lahoud with us this evening. She's a senior fellow in the New America's International Security Program, and that's the program at New America that our center is associated with. My co-director on the center, Peter Bergen, directs the International Security Program at New America and is also vice president there. So Nelly previously was an associate professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, an assistant professor in Goucher College, and a research fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. She has a really important and significant book coming out later this year called The Bin Laden Papers: How the Abbottabad Raid Revealed the Truth About Al-Qaeda, its leader, and his family. That's going to come out from Yale University Press, and it's really the definitive book on the key documents captured in Abbottabad in the raid that killed bin Laden. And so we're thrilled to see that book come out, and maybe we'll do an event also with Nelly when that book comes out. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Very briefly, our system for those who are new to these events is that Nelly will speak for a period of time, make a presentation, then we'll open to Q&A. I'll moderate that Q&A. And if you'd like to present a question, please type it into the Zoom question box, and I'll try to get to all the questions that are in the box. And please, present whatever questions and thoughts you have, and we're thrilled again to have you with us tonight. Nelly, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for the very kind introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to be part of this series. I'd like to note at the outset that this research was supported by the Minerva Research Initiative. It's a Department of Defense grant number 000-1421-12339. The principal investigator is Professor Mia Bloom from Georgia State University. And any opinions, findings, or recommendations expressed during my presentation are mine alone and do not reflect the views of the Office of Naval Research, the Department of the Navy, or the Department of Defense. So forgive me, but it's an important disclaimer to make. I started working on this project relatively recently, and my thanks to Mia Bloom for her valuable feedback. And needless to say, I would welcome the feedback of the audience. You will see from the slide and the themes that I'm covering is that I'm interested in the factors that enable the spread of conspiracy theories. But before I proceed, my research is based on the Arabic-speaking Middle East and North Africa, and you will hear me distinguish between top-down conspiracy theories, by which I mean state-sponsored or facilitated, and those that are horizontally spread. They're mainly spread through the internet and social media, and that may or may not have been generated by a state actor. The initial question driving this research was, what are the factors that facilitate the successful spread of conspiracy theories in the Arab world? But before long, I found myself asking an additional question. What are the factors that mute the spread of conspiracy theories? Let me explain. For as long as I remember, it has been assumed that conspiracy theories are prevalent in the Arab world more so than elsewhere, anywhere else. It's also been assumed, both in polite and impolite company, that Arab culture lends itself to conspiracy theories. To be sure, these assumptions have circulated mainly in media commentaries. And if you do a Google search on the topic, it will yield endless results by commentators, both on the right and on the left, and also including commentators in the Arab world. Curiously though, the academic literature on the prevalence of conspiracy theories in the West is vast, rich, and empirical, but very little is written about the Arab world in terms of conspiracy theories. A few notable studies deserve to be mentioned. In 1994, in an article entitled Conspiracy Thinking in the Middle East, Marvin Zones and Craig Joseph contended, and I'm quoting, that Arab Iranian Muslim culture supplies a predisposition to conspiracy thinking. In 1998, Daniel Pipes took their argument further in his book entitled The Hidden Hand, Middle East Fears of Conspiracy, asserting that, and I'm quoting, conspiracism constitutes one of the region's most distinctive political features. So much so, he thought that analyzing the region without grasping this matter is comparable to studying the American economy without Wall Street. In 2010, Matthew Gray, in his book, Conspiracy Theories in the Arab World, downplayed the cultural factor and argued that conspiracism occurs in the Arab world as a result of political structures. Now that conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, all the above, particularly in relation to COVID-19 and its vaccines, are at the forefront of concerns worldwide, surely it is worth revisiting long-held assumptions about Arab culture and conspiracy theories. Now, this yields some surprising results. Let me just show you a slide here. Taking a panoramic view at vaccination rates worldwide, it is immediately apparent that a wealthy Arab state, namely the United Arab Emirates, is weathering conspiracy theories in relation to COVID-19 and its vaccines, and is leading the world in vaccinating its population. By February 1st this year, more than 95% of the UAE's population was vaccinated using the Johns Hopkins tracking website. Other wealthy Gulf Arab states are all doing above world average, and you can see from that slide the vaccination rates listed in a column. Clearly then, Arab culture is not at play. Wealth, of course, is a factor in the sense that it has allowed these states to purchase vaccine early, and hence the high GDP per capita of these states as shown in the sixth column, according to the World Bank data. But as we shall see, there is more to the story than wealth. Rather than dwell on culture, I build on Matthew Gray's political structures approach and explore the subject through a state security prism. I decided to examine the conspiracy theories that spread in the aftermath of the Arab states' defeat during 1948 and 1967 wars against Israel, and the more recent ones related to COVID-19 and its vaccines. I had several reasons to choose these specific historical examples, that is the 48 and 67 wars. The first has to do with the fact that in conspiracy talks, Israel tends to be allotted the lion's share of the blame for the region's misfortunes. Second, the role of external powers, including that of Israel, meddling in the fate of Arab people, resurfaced during the pandemic. Third, many Arabs, especially Palestinians, continue to suffer as a result of the consequences of these wars. So these two wars present us with facts and realities of real conspiracies, but also with conspiracy theories. I'm interested in the latter, in the conspiracy theories, and I'm content that these were the reason why they were successful is because they were facilitated by Arab states. Now, I won't relate, I'll only say briefly the history leading up to these wars, but for our purposes, I want to focus on the magnitude of the Arab states' defeat and what was the response of Arab states to these defeats. 1948, and forgive me for relating facts that many of you are familiar with. In 1947, UN Resolution 181 recommended the partition of Palestine, paving the way for the independence of Arab and Jewish states. On May 14, 1948, Jewish nationalists went on to proclaim the state of Israel, and on the following day, the armies of 5 Arab League states, Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria, with the support of 2 contingents from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, invaded the nascent Jewish state. The Arab League's cable to the United Nations stressed that Palestine is an Arab country and called on the creation of the United States of Palestine that would enable all its inhabitants to enjoy equality before the law, thereby guaranteeing the rights of all minorities, including the small minority of Jews. Now, this last phrase, specifically small minority, is key to remember for our purposes. So between June 1, 1946 and May 15, 1948, more than half of the Palestinian population either fled or was expelled by Jewish forces, and some 750,000 Palestinian refugees lost their homes and meals of livelihood. So all the invading Arab military forces combined were no match for the small minority. What's more, not only did the war fail to provide Palestinians their independent state, but according to the United Nations, the State of Israel went on to expand its territory to 77% of Mandate Palestine, including the larger part of Jerusalem. For the Arab street, especially the Palestinians, the term AlNakba, the catastrophe, became synonymous with 1948. So how did Arab states explain their military defeat in the face of the small minority of Jews? Well, they resorted to justifications that centered around conspiracies and explanations that blended fictions with facts. Falling back on mu'amara, the Arabic word for conspiracy, this became the leaders' word du jour and tous les jours, or every day. Their political vocabulary ranged from invoking colonialism to blaming its local supporters and other domestic traitors and the like. Now, to be clear, it's not that there is no conspiracy, but the conspiracy theory, those fictions were really, this was what was mostly at play. So this political climate went on to enable the appeal of conspiracies surrounding the role of foreign powers in the Arab world. And between parentheses here, there were many fables and myths circulating in Israel about the birth of the state, but that's not what I'm studying. This is for another topic, not mine. In 1951, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion made its debut in the Arab world. The Protocols was a continuation of centuries of European and Russian anti-Semitism, but it initially failed to have the same currency in the Arab world. As Bernard Lewis explains, anti-Semitism, a hatred which is unique in its persistence, its universality, its profundity, and above all, its theological and psychological origins, did not exist in the traditional Islamic world. But in response to the 1948 humiliation, political concerns over Zionism began to find expressions in the Jewish threat inspired by the Protocols. Though some Arab intellectuals sought to discredit the Protocols and some engaged in introspective critique of Arab political culture, the popularity of this anti-Semitic work was given greater currency by the defeated leaders. It provided fodder to justify how a small minority of Jews could defeat the armies of a multitude of states. Thus, it was this top-down conspiracies that lent itself to the successful dissemination of the Protocols among the Arab public. According to Bernard Lewis again, the Protocols have at different times been publicly recommended or cited by Presidents Nasser and Sadat of Egypt, President Arif of Iraq, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, and numerous other kings, presidents, prime ministers, and political and intellectual leaders. Now, the same refrain of conspiracies was amplified during the 1967 war. The 1967 defeat was arguably more humiliating. In the lead up to that war, the rhetoric of Arab leaders was charged with threats. On May 30, 1967, in a speech marking a joint defense agreement with Jordan, President Nasser of Egypt, asserted that the challenge of the entire Arab community was not just about standing up to Israel, but we are up against all those behind Israel, he said. In other words, behind the small minority of Jews lie the military powers of Britain and the United States, on whose support the survival of Israel depended. In other words, Israel by itself is not strong enough for the Arabs. It's Britain and the United States. And never mind that the Soviet Union was supporting Israel and other Arab states, but of course this doesn't make it into his rhetoric. Bolstered by the closer military cooperation with Jordan, Nasser threatened that Arab states were no longer in the making speechless phase and that the cause for which they were fighting was about the rights of Palestine. On June 5th, within days of Nasser's ominous threats, Israel launched a preemptive war against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which it justified as defensive. The 1967 war lasted 6 days, and by June 10th, Israel had captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. How could Arab leaders explain their humiliating defeat within days of their magnified threats? Well, they did not hesitate to swap facts for fiction, resorting to explanations that centered on conspiracies to deflect from their own shortcomings and lack of preparedness to their public. According to Michael Oren's book, 6 Days of War, which is arguably the most comprehensive account of the war, and I'm using it quite a bit in that next section, Egypt's Air Force was eliminated in a matter of hours, while its propaganda organs, radio, and press continued to boast of extraordinary victories. Egypt's leaders were directly involved in the crafting of conspiracy theories. When Nasser was briefed on the immediate losses, his commander-in-chief, General Hakim Amir, declared that the US and not Israeli planes had performed the attack against Egypt. To enhance his fable, Amir went on to claim that one of the Egyptian pilots, Hosni Mubarak, had even seen the American jets with his own eyes. Of course, Mubarak became president in 1981. By the time that Nasser and Jordan's king, Hussein, spoke, the top-down conspiracy grew. There was now a multitude of foreign aggressors, who were now talking about United States and England, that were attacking. Now, the United States had gone to great pains to deploy diplomatic efforts to prevent Israel from waging war against its neighbors. So Washington was particularly dismayed at the absurdity of these fabrications. Oren reports that the US president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, was infuriated, and he dubbed the reports the big lie. Well, the big lie did not change the course of the war, but it allowed failed and defeated Arab regimes to maintain their grip on power. The big lie gained momentum as the news of US and British involvement was rapidly broadcast across the Arab world, resulting in hordes of angry protesters attacking American embassies in several cities. Even when Nasser decided to take responsibility for the defeat and resign on June 9th, he persisted with the same conspiracy claims. Following Nasser's speech, Egyptians took to the streets, rejecting their president's resignation and urging him to stay on. Other Arab leaders did the same. In response to their demands, Nasser rescinded his resignation. In the end, as Oren observes, Nasser succeeded where militarily he had capitulated, rallying the Arab world around his leadership. External powers meddling has become so ingrained that the same conspiracies keep on giving. With the onslaught of COVID-19, some who are conspiratorially inclined rushed to invoke the 1948 and 1967 wars to explain the virus as a plot orchestrated by external powers and to resist the vaccines. But the situation has changed considerably since 48 and 67, not least because we are in the information revolution age, which saw all Arab countries join the World Wide Web by 2000. The trend towards accessing news through social media platforms accelerated around 2018, and during the pandemic, people in the Middle East and Africa were spending more time online than those elsewhere in the world. But as numerous studies have shown, conspiracy theories have been spreading online. So all things being equal, the internet should deliver a horizontal access, equal access to information to all its users, including information that includes conspiracy theories. Now, these conspiracy theories have been credited with sabotaging the COVID-19 vaccination campaign. The infodemic, as it has been described, surrounding COVID-19 and its vaccines has been consequential on vaccine hesitancy. Thus, despite government-led intensive campaigns to counter misinformation in the West, and much to the dismay of the medical community, the horizontal spread of COVID-19 conspiracy theories has been successful, and vaccine hesitancy continues to breed more variants and results in unnecessary death. What then might explain why some Arab states are successful at muting COVID-19 conspiracy theories when the West is clearly struggling? I already noted the GDP per capita factor earlier, but I want to go back to that table to discuss another factor, because surely wealth in itself doesn't really explain this, because there are other wealthy Arab, wealthy states in the West, and they're struggling. But here, I'm going to look at another factor, which is about freedom of speech and freedom of the internet. So these are the total scores here. If you look at this column here, this is the states that are leading in vaccinations and are weathering conspiracy theories are also states that are assessed by Freedom House as not free. And you can see this is the general score. This is over 100, and you can see the internet freedom score. The first one here, which is over 25, it measures obstacles to accessing the internet. So they're doing relatively, not as bad. The second measures limits on content, so 9 over 35, 8 and 8 over 35. And the third measures violation of user rights, which is miserably low. By the way, Freedom House does 70 countries each year, so not all of them are included. So those that were not included, like Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and Oman, they have these country reports. And of interest to us is the freedom of expression and belief. And all three states score very low, 1 over 4 in terms of their freedom of expression. So to get a better sense of what I am talking about, I include several articles from the Federal Decree Law on Combating Cybercrimes in the United Arab Emirates. This is the country that is leading the world in vaccination. I won't read it. You'll see from the bits that I highlighted, and I'll go to another one. You get a sense of the penalties involved for even basic political speech that we would consider to be political speech, and you would see the penalties, both monetary as well as prison penalties. So the same laws that muted the spread of conspiracy theories in relation to COVID-19 have landed political activists in jail. According to a 2014 Amnesty International report, more than 100 peaceful activists and government critics have been prosecuted and jailed for politically motivated national security or cybercrime offenses. In 2021, a UN independent special rapporteur spoke of human rights defenders in the UAE being subjected to prolonged solitary confinement and other measures that violate human rights standards. Similar trends are in the other Gulf states. Now, elsewhere in the Arab world, the situation is different. Where internet freedom is partially free, the vaccination rates are below world average, with a notable exception of Morocco. And just this past week, Tunisia edged just a little bit above world average. As you can see from that table, these states have a low GDP per capita, and the states that have been ravaged by war, like Syria and Yemen, are faring terribly. But what is important here is like the internet freedom scores, they're way better than the Gulf states, and they are partly free, they are partially free. So you can see here where that there's more access to conspiracy theories, and looking at various media reports, including medical reports about what's happening in these countries. It's not that they are that they are poor in terms of having access to vaccines. It's because there is vaccines hesitancy. In many of these countries, vaccines are available and people are resisting them because of misinformation and conspiracy theories about the vaccines. So they are exposed to the same conspiracy theories that elsewhere in the world, including in the West, are circulating. But it's even noteworthy that COVID-19 conspiracy theories emanating from these states are converging with those that are propagated in Israel and in the United States and elsewhere. One of my favorite examples is an interview on the Arabic language TV channel Al-Hurra. The program hosted two experts. The first was Ali Fatoum, PhD and infectious disease expert based in Michigan and with verified credentials. I also think he is of Iraqi origin. The other, Majid Laani, is Iraqi and was introduced as viruses and immunology expert. When asked about concerns over the vaccine, Majid Laani, whose credentials are not verified and actually are questionable, he went on to speak about the side effects of COVID-19 vaccines. He claimed that they were far worse than the virus itself. He went on to add, Israel led the world in vaccinating its people, and the catastrophes the vaccine caused there are horrific. It appears, however, he said, that Israeli lawyers have managed to put an end to this catastrophe after they filed a lawsuit in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The lawsuit accuses the government of violating the Nuremberg law, and it is known that this law concerns crimes against humanity. That's according to him. Now, to establish the authenticity of his claims against the vaccines, Al-Ani repeatedly highlighted that he's basing his claims on information originating from none other than Israel. The irony did not escape Fatoum, the other PhD expert, who interjected and said, I am astonished by this kind of thinking, not least by an Arab doctor based in Iraq, and the first thing he cites is a lie coming out of Israel. In this instance, and in many others, we find a convergence among the conspiratorially minded, transcending boundaries and even overcoming enmities. A lawsuit by the law office of Sukovsky and Co., I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, was indeed filed in Israel in March 2021 before the International Criminal Court. When I went through Al-Ani's Twitter feed, I found that the sources he lists include Judicial Watch, which on its website describes itself as a conservative, nonpartisan educational foundation, and whose founder, Tom Fitton, is reported to be a supporter of former President Donald Trump. Other sources for Al-Ani is the UK-based The Exposé, that describes itself as an alternative to the lying mainstream media, such as the BBC, that broadcasts government propaganda and lies, according to its website. So Al-Ani's case is part of a wider trend, representative of a meeting of the minds, so to speak, bringing together views of those who are conspiratorially inclined. Ironically, COVID-19 conspiracy theories are being more effective at getting Arabs and Israelis to agree and succeeding where the Arab-Israeli peace process failed. To conclude then, conspiracy theories in the Arab world are best explained through a state security prism rather than attributing them to culture. But I'm afraid I don't have a positive note on which to conclude. The Arab states that are succeeding in muting conspiracy theories are also muting free speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nelly. That was a really fascinating presentation. And it touches on so many interesting issues that are both data drawn from a different part of the world than the US, of course, quite a few different states, and then issues that are very germane to political life here. But I'm wondering about the term you use, conspiracy theory, particularly because the first case that you talk about, the big lie of the 1967 war, where Nasser and others talk about Israel operating with the assistance of the US and UK military. To what degree was that perhaps propaganda rather than a conspiracy theory? I mean, in what sense is it useful to distinguish between conspiratorial thinking that might come from the bottom up, as it sometimes does, and purposeful presentations of a situation with a clear political goal of removing the defeat in that war from the responsibility of Arab states to like, the intervention of of powerful states with advanced militaries, et cetera, that would obviously give an enormous edge, to one military. But my real question isn't so much about the 67 big lie, but about this issue of, is it useful to distinguish between what might be called propaganda and conspiracy theories, or what do you think about that general idea?
I think this is a very valid question, and I think they do overlap. But I think in those instances, and I can see, I mean, some of these issues were also in Israel. Some of the ways the wars were explained in Israel were also littered with fables and myths, and you can say, they're all into the propaganda war, and that's a valid point to note. But for consistent, the Arab leaders and states have been consistent in terms of having these structures in place that would resort to the conspiracy claims before anything else. So, for instance, when the Egyptians lost within hours, probably by the 5th of June in 1967, within hours, the media just rushed to claim these extraordinary victories by the Egyptians. Now, this was not a fog of war perspective. It was just on automatic pilot almost. The media had a specific discourse that it was going to I mean, whereas in other countries where we would have the same propaganda and so on and so forth, but at least you would have various other institutions coming up with alternative views and so on. So I think there have been many instances where it's fiction really that prevails. It's and in the literature that I've consulted on conspiracy theory, it's not that conspiracies don't exist; they do exist. But we get into and there's plenty in the world, particularly in the Arab world, and external powers have indeed conspired against many Arab countries, and Arab countries conspired against others as well. So I don't want to diminish that political aspect of the story, but where I think the problem lies is when you start creating a fiction, things that they knew did not happen. They knew that it was not the US that was bombing. They knew that the British were not bombing, but they just went around and started discussing these aspects. So yes, I understand these variations, and I can see where the shades between propaganda and conspiracies might overlap. But it is no wonder why these continue to be ingrained, because if you do ask people, that I can understand why people in the Arab world are going to think of the external factor, of the plots by external factors, simply because these stories have been ingrained in their heads, because it's all their leaders who have repeated them. It's all the press that has reported on these issues, and it's also in countries where you risk being jailed. You end up having some intellectuals having to continue with these fables and myths, so they become ingrained as part of the political memory of people, and it becomes very, very tough. What I'm trying to say here is that it is very important to downplay the cultural element and to think of the political structures that have enabled these conspiracies to continue to be entrenched in the minds of some people. Sorry, I can't hear you. You're muted.
That seems to be a particularly important point with some of the literature on the Arab world, where there's a lot of cultural explanations for lots of behavior at the expense of, say, political analysis. We have a few questions here from the audience. From Ben Bender. Are the vaccination rates presented for the Gulf states for citizens only or for all residents? Also, what variation is there among the states in terms of requirements regarding COVID-19 vaccination?
Thank you. My understanding based on what I read, I think this is based on the populations. So the vaccination rates is about the population. So if you go to the Johns Hopkins website, it'll show you the number of people. Now, interestingly, for instance, as I said, the United Arab Emirates, which is leading the world in vaccinations, it's not mandatory to have, it's optional to be vaccinated in the UAE. I think Qatar may also be optional. What they have is some of these countries are requiring, not all of them, but some of them are requiring travelers to be vaccinated, but not all of them. So it's not as if, I think Saudi Arabia, it's also not mandatory, but I think in some public jobs, they're becoming mandatory. But they have been doing very, very well. Surprisingly, they've been doing very, very well in terms of their vaccination rates.
A question here from David Clark. Dr. Lahoud, is the aggressive misinformation and disinformation profile regarding COVID-19 that is present in English language media and social media also as prevalent in the Arabic platforms? Could that also account for reducing some of the exposure to COVID-19 misinformation?
Thank you. Yes, I get so from friends in the Arab world. I get quite a lot, not just in English but also in French. And you get all these, at some points, these supposedly doctors based in the United States talking about the vaccine, discouraging it, and literature that comes out in French as well, and these, so many of these messages that have reached me on WhatsApp about the vaccines, both from Europe as well as from English speaking countries. Yes.
I think maybe picking up on this, to what degree do you feel that some of the countries that have higher level of vaccination rates, which is sort of it's like a stand-in for this larger issue about misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, do you feel like the ability of the state to restrict and control access, at least to various forms of information, but particularly internet, is that associated with a higher level of kind of coherence of a nationwide narrative about COVID-19 and the vaccine and the efficacy of vaccines?
Actually, I'm not going to claim that I looked at the press of all these Arabic speaking countries, but most of these Arabic speaking countries that I looked them up, all their governments are doing very, very good job in terms of vaccine awareness, encouraging people to be vaccinated. It's highly organized. You look up their Ministry of Health websites. Everything is so. I don't have any criticisms for any of these governments, including the Gulf states. Very, very informative, very, very responsible approach. So I think they're all doing their best. And in those countries that are struggling in terms of their vaccination rates, I read a lot in the press about the vaccine hesitancy. Yes, I looked up all their GDP per capita is below 5,000. So, but that didn't seem to me to account for their low vaccine rate. And based on the press that I read about these countries, it is vaccine hesitancy. Surprisingly, Morocco is, it's one of those states that I found that to be partly free. So probably they have access to conspiracy theories, but they are leading. I mean, their GDP is just over $3,000 per capita, but they're doing well on all levels, and just a little bit. Tunisia just edged a little bit higher than the world average just the past week. But all the others, all the partly free, have been struggling because of misinformation.
So Morocco's an interesting case because even though it's not a particularly wealthy country by GDP per capita, it had quite severely restrictive COVID-19 policies, and the state was able to implement them, with a kind of rigor that would be sort of unimaginable in the U.S. and in a lot of other countries, and possibly in countries that had, freer political systems. And maybe we see this around the world. One of the strong arguments for, China's policies, a very large country, obviously with, huge potential risk from COVID-19. One of the arguments is that a benefit of having a strong centralized state that is authoritarian is the ability to protect the people from the ravages of pandemics. So, I
Right.
mean, it's one of the stories. You're not really a story of conspiracy theories, but a story of how strong centralized autocratic states can both control a narrative, but also, if they choose to, can control policy and even the movement of people without a great deal of serious contestation by other players in the society.
Yeah, Morocco may that's why I consider it to be an anomaly in this case. But the others that are partly free, the press that I read about them is the vaccine hesitancy. So it's the availability. The vaccine is available, but not enough people are signing up for the vaccine.
And back to this issue of conspiracy theories. Let's look at the word conspiracy. Is that the right term to understand vaccine hesitancy? There, and if so, there are conspiratorial reasons to be vaccine hesitant, and there are other reasons that are not conspiratorial. So the conspiratorial argument would be that it's really just an effort by, pharmaceutical companies to dominate your life, for example. That's one of the Kennedy argument, for example. But there are other arguments as to why you wouldn't take a vaccine that don't necessarily require a conspiracy to motivate them. So is it true that in the Arab world, or at least in the countries that you've been studying, is it true that it's the conspiratorial story that is dominating vaccine hesitancy as opposed to any number of other narratives and justifications?
I'm not sure what you mean by this, Daniel. Could you just explain a little bit more about it? What?
Sure. So like a lot of the conspiratorial ideas about the vaccine and about COVID policies is that it's an effort in the US, for example, for the government to gain excessive control over your freedom, or in the case of the pharmaceutical industry, for an industry to make a lot of money for something that is not required and may even be harmful. That's kind of like a conspiracy. There's like an underlying justification for this policy that has nothing to do with health, that people are benefiting from this false claim. But there are other reasons you might be vaccine hesitant that really don't require a conspiracy to motivate.
No, that's true. These are part of the stories. And when I speak with people who are from the Arab world who are resisting the vaccine, there is this pharmaceutical element is very much at play. Are they really, they're making money? And I say, so, but you're wearing masks. The people who are producing masks are also making money. Do you want to let go of your mask? And they say, no, we don't want to let go of the mask. I say, well, this is also making money. But you find quite a lot of, and again here, conspiracy theories may not necessarily be, because we don't know the misinformation and disinformation where it's coming from. But that willingness or readiness to accept these stories that somehow there is an external factor at play, that somehow what we are being told is not true, and particularly when you see, for instance, that somehow the United States, when you find stories about the United States really wanting to be behind it. Initially, it started with the United States is probably starting starting the virus itself. And at the time, the United States, we were doing so badly here. It was just like, how could the United States start the vaccine when we are, we were really in the midst of it? Why would the United States, and you say these things, why would the United States be part of this to control us when, the president and all the politicians in this country, they took their vaccines, publicly in order to encourage people. These seem to be, it's just, they didn't somehow, you would think that these were basic facts that would allow people to refute the pharmaceutical, the pharmaceutical takeover or big government, but somehow they were, and I'm not just talking about the Arab world, but also here and some of the things that we read. So yes, is it but in its basic sense, based on linguistically speaking, do we call it conspiracy? That is about where the differentiation between facts. Sometimes when things conspire and there is something factual, yes, sometimes pharmaceutical companies do want to, and they have a history of having conspired against some people, but and between fiction, and now we're in that land where the conspiracy theory is, we know the consequences of vaccine hesitancy, we know the consequences of not getting vaccinated, and still they are persisting.
We have two questions here from our friend Mia Bloom, who you referenced earlier. The first, I think I'll present you with both of them if that isn't too confusing. Following from Dr. Rothenberg's intervention, is a conspiracy theory and propaganda on a continuum in which propaganda is top-down when states do it, but conspiracy theory is bottom-up when it is not being spread by powerful elites? Actually, let's stick with that question, and then we'll go to the next one, because it's an interesting question.
That is actually a very good way to think about it. But the issue is when you say that it is bottom-up, how do you know that it is actually not by a state actor? I mean, it could be bottom up. It could be started by a state actor, or an algorithm or whatever. So how would you know that it is not by a state? So I'm putting the question to you now, because I think propaganda, I understand it is. It does make sense that it is top down. Bottom up, I'm not really sure that we can just limit it to non-state actors when it is bottom up.
I guess you might say that conspiracy theories tend to be believed by the people, certainly the people who traffic in them. Propaganda, as we know, sometimes works enormously well, and sometimes it falls flat. But I don't know if that's germane. A second question from.
Can I just before we go to that, if you don't mind? Just before, I mean, and this is where I think, some of the studies that I've looked in terms of what's happening in the virtual sphere, where the gap between falsehood and truth is really sometimes very difficult to find out. So there's a study by, I think her name is Samantha Porter, who did a study for back in 2018, where she identified, she warned about the fact that in the online world, it is very difficult. It is very difficult to move between what is actual truth and what is propaganda and what is conspiracy theory. So that gap between fact and misinformation is becoming very challenging for many people to work it out. And so, there are many instances behind in the virtual sphere where we might buy into it because it is being made. I mean, we can take this argument further, if you like, and you say, when you are watching ads on television, where does this lie? Are they trying to trick us into buying something? You can say advertising can have this question mark, or that shady area where it lies into the. So there are many instances where we find these layers are overlapping.
A second question from Mia Bloom. One issue, however, I think Bernard Lewis failed to account for is the underlying anti-Semitism of the blood libels in Syria in 1840 before the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is a question. It's a little bit of a moving us away, certainly from COVID, but to what degree? But I think it's helpful as a question in that there are long-standing conspiratorial narratives, conspiracy theories, and blood libel is, of course, one of them. Not only in Syria, but in many other places. So, what do you think of that claim?
I actually don't know about that claim back in 1840. I did not know about it. I think I do think that he's right. From my reading, my understanding of the Middle East, in terms of you'll find a lot of religious polemics between religious communities, but you'll find them to be on the basis of. So you'll find that the same things that could be said about Jews, say by Muslims and Christians, you'll find that the Jews would be saying them about Christians and Muslims and so on. So it's not as if they are, they accept their differences, but I don't know about blood libels or it seems to be something, I mean, I don't know about it. I've not read, I'd be interested if Mia would send me the reference to this and to see, but from my understanding, it is something, and I agree with Bernard Lewis's observation that this is something that is recent in the Arab world.
So one thing that this touches on, which gets to another question here, is just this general question of, are we talking about the same thing with these various kind of stories? Is vaccine hesitancy or rejection similar in form or in kind to the big lie of Western support for the Israeli army in the 1967 war, or blood libel, or various narratives about the ill doings of ethnic, religious, national groups that are other. There's a lot of different stories out there, or stories about a nation's history or people's history. So here's a question from Willia Simmons. I've done research on conspiracy theories in several parts of the world. One of our surprising findings is that education is not usually significantly related to beliefs in conspiracy theories. Do you see that in the Arab world? Also, could you speak to beliefs in conspiracy theories among immigrant workers and refugees in the Arab world? Obviously, substantial populations in a number of these countries.
I can't speak about the latter. It's not something that I've studied, but judging by many of the conversations that I had with intellectuals, yes, I agree with the former, with the first observation that not just in the Arab world, but even in anywhere else in this world that I've come across, that yes, education is not a factor. I remember when I very first came to the United States back in 2004. It was my first year in the United States, and I go to the APSA, and after the conference ended, and here I had been asked by people, about conspiracy theories in the Arab world. It's something that always comes up, and I'm waiting for the bus, and I'm speaking. The person next to me, he happens to be a constitutional scholar, and the first thing that he wanted to tell me about, and if you all remember what happened in 2004, the John Kerry versus George W. Bush election campaign, he wanted to convince me that John Kerry had lied about his medal in Vietnam. Right now, this was a constitutional scholar, and he went, and this was, one of those. It's a bit like Nasser and what Nasser and the King of Jordan were doing about that the Americans were bombing. It's yes, education. I agree, education is not a factor in belief in conspiracy theories, but. I do want to say something about all the questions, and these are very, very helpful because it helps me kind of, try to play a little bit about the term when we use conspiracy theories and so on. And I was just talking a little bit with Daniel earlier about some scholars actually have written very interesting, philosophical essays in defense of conspiracy theories. And why it is important to take them seriously, not to disregard. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make here, and I'm selecting these specific examples, is that We have an opportunity now that the entire world is overwhelmed with conspiracy theories, or you want to call them misinformation, disinformation about COVID-19, and let's really test it now that the entire world is taken by storm by these conspiracy theories. Let's go and revisit the cultural factor about the Arab world. And here, what I found is that it's actually the states that's deciding what people are doing in relation to some aspects. And it turns out that the leading country in the world in vaccination and in weathering conspiracy theories is actually an Arab country. But you look into it a little bit more further. They're also muting political speech. It's not a happy story, but it makes us a little bit more uncomfortable about the cultural argument.
So we only have a few more minutes left. I'm wondering, since this is such a pressing question around the world, which is, how can accurate information about important issues, whether it's COVID-19 or other issues, be effectively communicated to, mitigate, social problems and misunderstandings, sometimes that has some pretty severe impact on society. So what have you learned from your comparative study of conspiracy theories related to COVID-19 in the Arab world that gives us some guidelines for how to craft, more effective responses to the problem of conspiracy theories?
I wish I have the answer. That's way above my. The thing is, as I said, I look up their Ministry of Health. I listen to what many of their health ministers were putting out. I mean, what they struggled at times, and this is some everybody struggled with the CDC in the United States and elsewhere, because we didn't have enough information earlier on. And sometimes the information in pandemics, it's gradual. Sometimes you end up changing your mind about what you thought a day earlier. And so this is, and people sometimes are waiting to hear something that it is very consistent, as if the information that was said 18 months ago should still hold. And I think this is tough, but it's not a question that I find we're able to criticize, but again, I have to say, and I don't know about others, but probably myself and the people who are on the Zoom, we have a lot of time on our hands. We read a lot, and we kind of search a lot. And I remember the first month of the pandemic, I couldn't do anything but read. I think short of finding a vaccine, I knew everything about that there was something, anything that was worth knowing. So I think we read a lot, and we're still struggling. But it doesn't mean that there's certain things that governments can do and certain things that they can't do. It's a little bit like terrorism. You can't always, this is where I come from. You can't always counter all the terrorist attacks. In the same way, you can't always find all the right words, particularly in pandemics. Our expectations should be also reasonable from governments.
Well, your work brings up a lot of fascinating tensions between, the potential values of autocratic states that limit free access to information and limit political freedoms, as well as, a whole series of other issues that come out of here, including like the difficulty of mitigating, controlling stories that are grossly false about all sorts of issues, COVID, but no doubt lots of other issues. It's a tricky terrain.
Yeah, but is this a cost that we want to pay? Do we really want to the same articles in the UAE, if you criticize the ruler, you could be landed in jail. These are the same laws that are applying. The fact that we can't, that people can't raise issues about something basics as, can you imagine telling an American not to criticize the president of the day?
And that they'd be jailed if they did so.
And then they would be jailed if they did so. Imagine what that is like. Is that a cost that we're willing? Yeah. But you're right. These are really difficult issues. But do we want to give up on our freedoms?
So on that note, thank you so much, Nelly Lahoud, for joining us this evening. Really learned a lot from your presentation. Our
Thank you so much.
next presentation in the Spring Speaker Series is from Bishop Garrison, called Diversity and Inclusion in America's Society and Military, Why It Matters. He's senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Human Capital, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we're really thrilled that he'll be speaking with us next week. I'm sorry, this is February 16th. And we hope you can join us. If you're obviously on our email lists, and you can please reach out to us if you have any questions or if you're not on the list. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks for spending some time with us. Thank you so much, Nelly Lahoud, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.